Scano, Ami Tansi, welcome. I want to thank you for the time that this is the most precious thing that you can give to us is your time, and I want to thank you for that. I also want to give thanks to Andrew, my colleague, for co-creating this presentation with us. And I want to just take a moment to acknowledge that we are across many territories here. So we're going to do a little tiny bit of a land acknowledgement in a minute. First, we're going to do some brief intros. We're going to do an overview after that, some housekeeping, and we're going to encourage that if you have, sorry, we're just looking at we are getting the sound effects for chat, but not people speaking. Catherine, is there anybody else that cannot hear? And you can either text it or unmute yourself and say, can you hear us or not? My audio is working fine. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on with you, Catherine. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to do. Can everybody else hear? Can people just give a quick yes if you can hear in the chat box? Okay, great. Looks like majority of you folks can hear. So, okay, and then what we would like to do before we get into the land acknowledgement and the overview is just a bit of housekeeping. Part of that would be, like we said, to mute yourselves, unless you would, just keep yourselves muted because we'll be doing questions at the end. And we are encouraging you to type in your questions into the chat box. And for folks sitting here in the room, if you want to write down any questions that you want to keep in mind, what we'll do is go over the presentation. And at the end, if there still aren't questions that we've answered just by presenting, then we'll try to get those covered at the end. And then here in this room, we can stay behind and talk a little bit more if you want to do that too. Andrew, is there anything else you wanted to add for housekeeping?
No, I think that's about it. We still have a few people that would be great to mute your lines. I'll be going through the chat box, trying to reply, keep on top of things, but that's a really good way of flagging questions. Steph and I can pause what we're talking about and address some of these questions as we go along. Okay, we wanted this to be kind of a back and forth as much as possible. So please use that. And we wanted to really create a safe space here. Okay, and we know that for many of you on the call today, this is going to be some new stuff and some stuff that you're interested in and might not have a very deep background about. So again, feel free to put your questions in there. And, all questions are good questions at this point. So we want to do this and other webinars to kind of raise everyone's awareness about some of these issues. But again, it starts with you guys identifying what the questions are and us trying to make you comfortable in, I guess, progressing and then moving forward to engaging some of these Indigenous partners. Other than that, I think we're good. As long as the audio is working, this does tend to be buggy, so just again in the chat or send me a message. You can send messages to certain people, and we can see what we can do.
Okay, so I just wanted to take a moment to offer what is kind of a new thing, and I was sort of trying to think about how can we do a land acknowledgement when we're across the virtual space. So this is sort of Western and Indigenous meeting up for the first time during this entire webinar in the very beginning, and I think it's an interesting question to ask. I took a look at the everybody that signed up just to see where you're from and the territory that we're covering, and it looks like we're pretty much all across Canada. And that's pretty interesting because, as you'll see, there are some, if you take a look at Canada, Andrew, you're seeing that okay, right?
Yeah,
so this is a vast expanse of territory, and right now, the way that it currently is, we're cut up into all of these different provinces. But what we're trying to show in some way is that if you look at this through the Indigenous lens, you're going to see a couple different ways of seeing land and territory with seeing through an Indigenous lens. So part of that would be,
What?
can you please mute yourself? There you go. Okay, so this is from a really wonderful application that if you haven't had a chance to download, you can download it on your phone. You can take a look at it on your computer. It's called nativeland.ca. It's a wonderful resource to have as a researcher, and it will help you immediately establish the territory that you're on wherever you are. So as you saw, the previous slide shows that these are the provinces over Turtle Island. And this is what we would say are the treaty areas in Turtle Island. So you can clearly see that there are no treaties, say, on the west coast in BC. That's an unceded territory. There's unceded territory on the east coast as well. And then you can also start to see where all of the land claims and treaty areas are. You can also see things on that app by language group, which is really interesting. So you can start to see which languages you might need to pick up if you're going into a certain research area. So maybe get some understanding of pleasantries you might say in Cree or in Gwich'in or Dene. So that's very helpful. And then also you can see the traditional territories of these areas, and they very much overlap. So in order to do a land acknowledgement for something as large, sweeping, and versatile as this presentation, all I can do is kind of reflect back on my own understanding of where we are, which is that we're in Kanata, which is spelled Kanata, and Ganigeha, or Mohawk, and that means the big village. So Kanata was actually named after that Mohawk word, the big village. But depending on where you are, that could be very different, depending on the worldview of that nation whose territory you're on. So take a look at nativeland.ca. Take a look at it when you're traveling, and it's not perfect. There are certainly there's more information that needs to be put in, but they're working on it. But I will say this is probably one of the most comprehensive ways to understand where you are in relation to Indigenous people. So our goal today is to address a few key questions. We want to, and I'll just back this up just by saying a lot of this webinar, it originated initially from questions that we get from our colleagues here, young professionals, right up to tenured professors who have approached me, approached Andrew, approached Indigenous studies all the time, just asking for this exact type of webinar. They want to know, just on a one-on-one basis, how do we work better with Indigenous communities? What is it that we can do? I think oftentimes folks are afraid of offending or re-traumatizing. So this is it's just something that keeps coming down the pipeline, and people reaching out to me via email or just in the hallway. So I like to be able to kill as many birds with one stone as I can. So the webinar just seemed like the most reasonable way to do that. You can also reach out to me or Andrew just in general too, just to be able to, via email, if we don't answer any of these questions, or any specific questions you have today. But ultimately, I'm hoping that we can answer at least the beginning. This isn't an in-depth, it's an hour-and-a-half long webinar, so we're not looking to recreate the world here. We're just trying to give you some high-level information. So we want to talk about why this work is necessary. We want to talk about what it looks like on the ground and give you some practical case studies. We want to talk about what it looks like when you put this into practice, so how you put this into practice as a researcher, whether you're non-Indigenous or Indigenous. We want to talk about who's setting these standards right now and what's included in those standards. And then also just practical things like, when do you begin? How do you begin this, and when do you begin it? And then also we want to address, like we said, your questions. Did you have anything you wanted to add, Andrew?
I just wanted to point out that this is one of many of these sessions that we have planned over the next couple of years. So we're not going to cover it all in one day for sure. But Stephanie and I are looking to create other forums and opportunities for all of you to learn more about this.
So you are our community, and I wanted to say, in the spirit of that community consultation that we're promoting, that we want to hear your questions and needs, and that to us is community consultation in action, to not just to deliver this information, but to get feedback and questions from you as well. So life goals. The reason I'm doing this, and I won't speak for Andrew, but the reason that I'm doing this is because as an Indigenous woman from Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Agreement territory, my role here is I am a steward of this land. I'm an herbalist, I'm an ethnobotanist, and I have been very rarely ever visible in this field. And when I came back to school much later in life, I felt relatively invisible, and I felt like I was starting to, I was entering into a paradigm that didn't include me. So that can actually be quite harming to people that are just sort of trying to actually, that don't have a voice to begin with, and to enter into an institution where they're oftentimes erased. So what I've felt best doing here, and the projects that I've participated in, are the ones where I've been asked to collaborate on projects with Western researchers. And my most favorite experiences so far have been ones that have been co-creative, and where I've actually been able to envision research questions with Western academics from the inception of a question. So that's kind of what we're trying to do here. Is my life goals are to disrupt that old paradigm and to sort of create this new world with this new, well, young and old. It's not really about just young professionals. It's about making this change at any point in time. So.
Yeah, and I wanted to just reflect on that a little bit because, you know, I think this life goals, it was a very personal slide for Stephanie, but I think we can all relate to it in some way. I think we are all doing research that would be enriched and really benefit by having that kind of Indigenous perspective and worldview and research partners in it. And again, that's not something that's done as part of academia, right? So I think we're all here to disrupt that old paradigm and do this work in a totally different way than how it was done. Okay, so I hope that you can all kind of see yourself in that a little bit, because this is kind of the square one where we wanted to start a lot of this dialogue about today.
Okay. So one of the first questions that we're asking is why? Why is this research engagement necessary with Indigenous communities? What is the difference sort of between what you've been taught in academia and what you know now versus what you're hoping to get out of this, basically, and seeing some of those disparities. So we're looking at it from, you know, a couple different perspectives. That Indigenous people may only make up about 4.9% of the population, but we're also young and we're growing. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. We want to talk about the value of Indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge as an indicator and a sort of parallel to Western science. The word reconciliation gets thrown around a lot, but we want to talk a little bit about what that looks like in research. And ultimately, we want to be able to sort of break down some of these Western concepts of how research has been evolving and what it looks like as we're moving into this new paradigm. Anything you want to add with that, Andrew?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay. So why? Why is this necessary? The AFN produced a report back in 2007 that is really a great piece. It's in our resources section. It's a great piece to take a look at in depth and drill into some of the OCAP principles we're going to be talking about. And they established that through deep community engagement, that some of the reasons that research engagement needs to change with Indigenous communities is because of some of these ideas, that there's a lack of community involvement in this process. There's a tendency to kind of come into a community and have your own idea of what that looks like, or the research question that you have, and you sort of enact the project without any specific involvement or direct involvement from that community. There's a lack of individual and community benefit from the research, so it's basically something that has nothing to do with anything the community would directly benefit from. It's more coming in, taking something and leaving, which is really kind of a metaphor for the resource extraction of, it's a metaphor for colonization in a lot of ways. We'll talk about what settler colonialism is versus colonialism. So that would look like, research that has nothing to do with the community and what they need, or a lack of compensation to those participants in the community, maybe not hiring anybody from the community for your project. There's very often a lack of informed community consent, or there has been in the past. So, you want to make sure that you're talking with communities about the risks and the health and safety impacts of your research ahead of time, and that there is an actual informed consent to that. And also there's a pressure to support a project, basically imposing our own will upon communities and not really hearing what it is that they want or need. Additionally, there's research agendas being dictated by personal or academic interests, so CV builders, and seeing First Nations as, rungs on a ladder of climbing up that academic ladder to tenure, rather than hearing our priorities and our interests. There's a lack of community ownership of the data. This is a big one that we'll talk about, meaning that there's no control over the analysis of that data, or interpretation and reporting of that data. And also who has access to the data. So we're going to talk about some solutions to that. There's also this tendency to focus on Indigenous communities as settler researchers in a way that stigmatizes and stereotypes us, and what we call sort of deficit-based research, where we're trying to prove that a community is, we're not focusing on the resiliencies of the community. We're only focusing on sort of downtrodden, poverty-stricken, Indigenous people, and using that as a way to prove that research needs to happen in that area. That doesn't really do anything except for further harm us, and basically we start to internally stigmatize ourselves as well. So it doesn't focus on our resiliencies, and I think that's something moving forward that we really want to focus on, is uplifting our First Nations informants and collaborators. And also there's a lack of respect towards our cultures and beliefs, including a misinterpretation of our Indigenous knowledge and our practices. And we'll talk a little bit about the concept of pseudoscience, and that's a Western concept that really circumscribes Indigenous knowledge into something that could really benefit is actually thrown into the trash as pseudoscience. So as I was saying, we're a young population. We make up about 4.9% of Canada's population right now, and that means about 1,673,785 reported on the 2016 census, with an average age of about 32 years old. So just to be clear, this is a census report, so we have to be critical in thinking that not everybody reports on the census. And you have to think about, have you reported on the census? Did you participate in that? And why people might not actually participate in the census, being for reasons of maybe establishing sovereignty from the Canadian government. So these are the lowest possible numbers, but we're seeing many, many more on top of this. And Andrew made a good point in that we may be a small amount of the population, but all research in Canada is 100% located on Indigenous territory. So I want to take a moment right now to not only acknowledge the value of traditional knowledge and what that looks like, but also to honor Grandma Josephine Mandamin. She just passed away earlier today, or I got notice of it this morning that Josephine passed on. She's been ill for a while, and anybody who knows who Josephine is, you'll know what a valuable elder she's been to us as Indigenous people. If you don't know who Josephine is, she's an Ojibwe elder who started this concept of the water walk. So she's a water keeper, and she walked around all of the Great Lakes, I believe, like the entire all 5 of them, and really started the snowball of other water walkers. She started a lot of people's worlds on fire, and really sparked true inspiration in that water walking movement. So as we move into World Water Day coming up on March 22nd, I'd urge you to take a look at her work if you're not familiar with her. She's just truly an inspiration, and she really speaks to this concept of co-creation better than almost anybody else I've known has, in that she's saying that traditional knowledge is a way of life for the Anishinaabe people and is handed down to us from our ancestors. She's saying that their knowledge is being misused, abused, and misunderstood, and that science does not respect traditional knowledge, that we need to come together as one, that scientists need to sit down with us and understand where we come from, that we have intricate knowledge of medicine, animals, and flow, and that Anishinaabe people live in the environment, know the elements, and know how to take care of ourselves. Many scientists have come to terms that traditional knowledge is as important as science, and that there needs to be a balance between science and traditional knowledge. And she's encouraging us to all work together toward a balance. She's such an inspiration to the way that I've approached research, and I just wanted to put down some tobacco in my heart for Josephine and everything that she's done for us.
I just wanted to jump in there for 1 second there, Steph.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the work that we do here at Laurier is up in the Northwest Territories. And one elder in particular that we're going to show a picture of him later, Leon Andrew from Toledo. He's part of our co-created project. And he describes this as kind of two streams becoming one, is that there are different values and knowledge, but if we're going to solve some of these problems with respect to water, with respect to climate change, again, it's sitting down, and having respect for both of these knowledge systems, but figuring out how we can create knowledge together. Okay, and this is kind of where we come in as researchers, and valuing the relationships that we can build with communities to bring these knowledge, bring all the knowledge to the table, and figure out how we can move together or move forward together, right? So it's a spirit and a sentiment that we see in a lot of different communities. Both traditional knowledge and science have a role to play. What that means is very kind of place-based and specific to the context of what's happening in the community. But I think there's the willingness on all partners to kind of sit down and start having those conversations. And that's a really big potential role for us to play as researchers.
So just a really brief overview of what the Indigenous worldview is, and Andrew and I were talking about this a little bit when we were creating this slide, that we're not asking you to be experts in the Indigenous worldview. We're just asking you to understand what it looks like when we situate it next to the Western worldview, and to sort of reflect on that, because what we're trying to do is combine these two worldviews together into a new type of inquiry. So to understand a little bit more about what a worldview is, it's basically an overall perspective from which one sees, experiences, and interprets the world. A society can hold a common worldview, including a collectively held constellation of philosophy, basic assumptions, values, and ethics. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what worldview is. And if we take a look at our slides here, it kind of is just a visual of what the Indigenous worldview is in juxtaposition to the Western worldview. So the Western worldview is the one on your left-hand side, and that is a hierarchical worldview at which human beings are at the top, and everything else kind of goes underneath of us. Everything is, if you take a look at that triangle, you'll see humans there, men at the top, and then women right underneath, and I think that's a big blue whale, so mammals we're looking at, and then some like lesser mammals and hoofed animals, and going down and looking at actually the things that are really at the base of our ecosystem and support our ecosystems, like fungi and the animal, the plant world, and even just amoeba are at the bottom, and that globe or the world is actually split up into all these different nations in this sort of nationalistic way. So all these boundaries are defined and this hierarchy. So they call that the heteropatriarchy, and that's one of the perspectives that has been very commonplace in Western research. The Indigenous worldview and is very different looking in that it's very holistic and cyclical. We are very we're not at the top of that hierarchy. We're at we're just a part of a process and a cycle. So you'll see us inserted into that worldview in a way that isn't defining boundaries or borders. It's very natural. We're not above nature. We're a part of nature. And I think by hearing that and seeing that that difference, you can start to see that we see our responsibilities as Indigenous people to all of creation, and that we're a part of that. That if we harm creation, if we harm something in that world, we're harming ourselves. So we actually, in the Haudenosaunee creation story, for example, in our Thanksgiving address, not the creation story, but the Thanksgiving address, we go through a whole list of things that we give thanks to. And we start with the things that are the closest to the earth, so the land and the water, and then the animals and the grasses and the shrubs and the berries and the four-leggeds and the two-leggeds. And ultimately, we work up to we're the last one that we give thanks to. We're the younger brothers, and we're the newest form of life here on this planet. So we have to, for ourselves, we acknowledge that we know much less than the rest of creation, and that we're here to uphold it, serve it, and steward it. So in our research, you'll see that reflected, that our research isn't just about asking these large sort of modeling questions and stuff. It's about what we were talking, you'll see this in some of the research questions we have later, but is our fish okay to eat? Is this something that, if we do this, is it going to harm something else in the environment? It's a really interesting way of seeing a worldview. It might feel a little unsettling if you're not used to it, but if you start to look at yourselves as it being a part of creation and a part of the world, a part of nature, the way that you treat it might change a little bit, and that's what we're hoping to accomplish with that. We're hydrological researchers, so we're looking at things through a water lens as well, and I think it's important to know that Indigenous views on water are very, very specific, and they're quite universal across Canada and are what we would consider Turtle Island, North America, in that water is life-giving, and you can understand that if you're thinking about, where do we all come from? We come from water. We're made of water. Water is a living entity that we're responsible to protect. We consider it our lifeblood. It's in all aspects of creation, and that we're interrelated. And it's not just for drinking, but water is sacred. It's meant for our medicines. It's meant to use in our cleansing and purification in our ceremony, which are a part of our ways of being, doing, and knowing. And ultimately, water is the women's territory. Water is the women's realm. So when you're looking at including informants and collaborators in your research, and you're working with Indigenous research questions, it's important to include Indigenous women when working with water. We're the water keepers. You'll see at the top of these images, we have one of our principal investigators, Dr. Dawn Martin Hill, on the far left, and then we have Grandma Josephine carrying her copper bucket, and that's her water keeper bucket. She carries that water with her when she was walking around the Great Lakes. Next to Josephine is Judy De Silva from Grassy Narrows First Nation. She's the woman who established some huge activism and instituted some major changes up in the north with mercury poisoning in water from runoff from the logging and paper industry. And then we have our, on the far right is Sky Woman, and that's from the Haudenosaunee creation story, and she's falling through a hole in the sky down to water. So water is in our cosmologies, it's in our bodies, it's in our blood, it's in our wombs. So water and women are essential. And when you're working with Indigenous communities and water research, that would be one of the major reasons for why it's important to include women in those research questions. In fact, E. Benson Benai said in 1998, the earth is said to be a woman. In this way, it is understood that women preceded man on earth. She is called Mother Earth because from her come all living things. Water is her lifeblood. It flows through her, nourishes, and purifies her. So just briefly, we want to talk about kind of why I think research came to be the way it is in academia, and what Western academia has done in some ways in the context of colonization. So there's this concept, and we won't be focusing on these deficits a lot. I think we've probably all had a lot of conversations around colonization, but really there's this concept of the Doctrine of Discovery. And that's a concept that really basically frames Indigenous people and the land here on Turtle Island as being something that they considered terra nullius, quote unquote. And terra nullius means basically like open for the taking, that you can just kind of come onto this land, and if there's nobody that's a Christian, a follower of Christianity, that they were considered subhuman, which means that they didn't have the same rights as a human being. We were considered animals in that regard, or savages in another way of speaking. So that's something that really kind of set the precedent for taking land and seeing it as a resource. And also it kind of comes into research as well, in that these questions in our territories are still in some ways considered through that spirit of terra nullius. So we're really trying to change that and really show that we're still here. We actually have, we're not extinct, which we often get, is that as Indigenous people, people often have approached me and not even realized that I'm a real Native person. They think that we're all extinct, which is still strange to me, but it happens. So we just want to be very careful and seeing the vast expanses of territory where folks may not actually be living, but these are territories that are where we have our medicines, our foods, our hunting grounds, our ceremonial grounds, our burial grounds. These are all across the territory. So whether or not somebody's living there, it doesn't mean that it's terra nullius. It's still our territory that we act on. I wanted to also bring up this concept of settler colonialism. So we often talk about this word colonization, and people kind of understand what that means, but when we start talking about colonialism and we start using the word settler, people get a little unsettled. So Patrick Wolf said it best when he starts to talk about settler colonialism being distinct from colonialism, in that it's not just coming in to a territory and doing some resource extraction and then hightailing it out of there and going back to where you came from, but you're coming to stay and you're destroying things and replacing them. So that means that you're settling in an area and you're putting down roots and you're imposing your will upon that territory. And oftentimes, as we can see through the genocide that's ensued on this territory since, at least 1491, if not before that, that there was a great deal of erasure and that destroying to replace. So what we're looking for is, replacing that concept of settler colonialism with an allyship. So to really briefly touch on that, if we look at just some of the essential foundational policy of Canada and of the work around trying to settle this place and claim it. There's the Flood-Davin report that came out in 1878. This is quite a long time ago, but that was one of the foundational documents that basically stated that the mission and the goal of this nation is to destroy the Indian. And basically they did that through assimilation and genocide and many other things. The pass system, residential schools. As you know, there's just many, many ways that we've been able to, that there have been some silencing and some erasure, and ultimately it's all to be able to destroy us, and not just to destroy us as people, but to destroy our worldview and to take us and disconnect us from that so that we can just assimilate into the colonial project and become good citizens. So that's our sort of horrible history, and that's about as much as I want to get into that horrible history. We're not going to talk a lot about the violence and deficits. We want to talk more about the positive ways that we can uplift and celebrate our relationship as allies and accomplices and collaborators. So that started, I think, more officially with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we're talking about, people often say, like, what is reconciliation about? Or there's this concept of reconciliation as this big overarching kind of thing, but not really looking at it as what it looks like on the ground. And reconciliation is ultimately just defined as, in that report, it's about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between, and their language is Aboriginal, although we're using the term Indigenous throughout this presentation, between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country. In order for that to happen, there has to be an awareness of the past, an acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, an atonement for the causes, and an action to change that behavior. So it's about respectful relationship through awareness, education, history, an acknowledgement of that harm being inflicted, and not just an atonement and a saying that we're sorry, but then actions behind those words. And Marie Sinclair said a while ago, where do we want to be in 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 generations from now when we talk about the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country? Reconciliation will be about ensuring that everything that we do today is aimed at that high standard of restoring that balance to that relationship. So again, it's about restoring a balance of power. And just looking at this little word cloud that we generated about some of the concepts of what reconciliation is on the ground, one of the biggest words that came out was a responsibility and an acknowledgement, recognition, and ultimately, I'm just going to list off some of these contexts of what reconciliation is. Not all of them. You can take a look at the TRC report for all of them, and that's also in our sources. But it's complex, it's multifaceted, it's critical, and as researchers, we're really good at being critical and asking critical questions. It's a process. It's not just a concept, but it's actually a process that we're going through. It's working towards solidarity between us as a people. It's a responsibility of every Canadian. It's honoring our treaties. It's acknowledging and respecting our rights and title. It's letting go of negative perceptions and stereotypes, acknowledging the past and ensuring that history never repeats itself, learning about our history as Indigenous peoples from us in our own words, recognizing the intergenerational impacts of colonization, attempts at assimilation, and cultural genocide. Especially when it comes to health research, we can see that in social determinants of health and the disproportionate levels of, say, something like autoimmune disease or the disparities in health between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Recognizing critical roles that we've held in creation here, especially in our contributions to protecting this nation, taking responsibility as a person, a parent, an employee, and a researcher to never utter, accept, or ignore a racist comment, or never utter, accept, or ignore a statement that includes stereotyping. So really just speaking out when you see an injustice happening, not hiding behind your privilege in that way. And then having respect for us, having respect for our beliefs, our cultures, our worldviews, our challenges, our traditions, our goals. They don't need to be yours exactly, but just to have respect that we can hold those things as sovereign people. And then recognize that and support that we're deeply connected to the land. Support that we're reclaiming our identity, our language, our culture, our nations. And then really, ultimately, reconciliation is healing for all of us. So that's just in a nutshell, and I know that's kind of peppering through all of those really quickly, but again, in our sources, I have lots of different resources for you to download and just for further reading after we're done with all of this. Okay. Did you want to add anything to that, Andrew?
Yeah, I did want to not let you do the whole. Well, it's really interesting to think about kind of what our role in this is as researchers. And a lot of things that we do, again, I'm speaking as a social scientist, and then as a social scientist, we have this term called positionality. And that really kind of talks about who we are and what shapes our worldview. And it's a really interesting exercise to go through for everyone because it does acknowledge that we as researchers at institutions across Canada have a lot of privilege in what we do. And that is part of this, like, and to me, reconciliation is figuring out how to bridge that gap between what we have because we're in the system and what some of our Indigenous communities and our Indigenous research partners lack as part of the same system. And so if we're to think about what reconciliation means in research, for me, from kind of I guess I do climate change adaptation in communities, it's figuring out how to reallocate a lot of that privilege back to communities. And that's really kind of informs what I do as kind of a knowledge mobilizer and a researcher. But it's an exercise that I think everyone kind of needs to go through. And Steph, you say it from time to time, and just about kind of checking yourself and kind of where you come from. And because that all informs what your worldview is, and acknowledging that difference, acknowledging that you're in this system that is part of the problem, and figuring out how there's ways of I guess, establishing that new paradigm and creating reconciliation points through your research, right? So how do we transfer a lot of this privilege, knowledge, whatever you want to call it, back to the people who need it, or are owed it, or whatever I guess word you want to put in there. And to me, that's kind of our challenge as researchers who get to access all sorts of grants for research on Indigenous land, and it gives us this strange power dynamic in this relationship. So one of the things we need to start thinking about as researchers is how, through our actions and our research, we can transfer a lot of that power back to the community. Okay, and this is really a lot of the stuff we're trying to get out today, and a lot of the themes we talk about in just kind of knowledge mobilization more broadly is how to use the knowledge we create to better society. And here we're just really talking about, again, 4.9% of the population, but this population that has been suppressed through hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So it's a really useful exercise, and I encourage you all to kind of go through it as well, because it really kind of informs where you are and kind of really gives you a path on where you want to go. So it's something to reflect on, I think.
Andrew, do you have a moment in your work as a researcher up in Delaunay or many of the areas that you've been working in where you kind of had that sort of epiphany, or what sort of sparked that interest in you to kind of step out of this old paradigm?
I can't probably name one thing, but I think I do what I do because it makes a difference in communities. I typically say I'm a pretty terrible academic because I don't sit down and write papers. But if you kind of look at the work that we do in communities, you can see that direct benefit. And I guess that's the work that I'm most proud of in what I'm able to do. And that's really kind of reconciliation in action, which is, great. For me, it's, you can talk about social justice and all this stuff. I do it typically through a food lens, right? Like, is the water safe to drink? Is the fish safe to eat in terms of climate change impact? And in some of these communities that just lack a tiny bit of capacity or support or energy that you can provide, you can actually go a long way. And it's addictive, to be quite honest with you, because it builds that trust in that relationship, and then it just kind of steamrolls from there, right? I see Blair Carter's on the line. Blair Carter actually started with me in my kind of adventures up in this small town of Coquesa in the Northwest Territories, which is a community of about 40 people. And Blair and I did a like a climate change adaptation project with the community. And it was just this one thing that the community really kind of rallied behind, and we were able to support them in envisioning climate change adaptation, not only research, but like community action. And what stemmed out of that has been everything from on the land knowledge transfer camps to a recycling and a composting project that we've built. And it's strange as a researcher, you kind of flip between these two worlds of community action and what is research and what is not research. And that might be a struggle from maybe from more the natural sciences perspective, but there is an application of everything we do that can be a direct benefit to communities. And it's through that relationship and the dialogue that you can build that you can kind of see how these two can be very related, but also very separate. So I often have a struggle compartmentalizing what is research and what is the fun community action work. But it's a place where you can actually make a really big difference, and it's very rewarding once you get there.
And ultimately, thanks for sharing that. And I do feel that as I see people coming into this mode of research, it's a transformative experience for you. I see people who didn't know what they were getting into, and like you were saying, there's this concept of what's research and what isn't research. People are very formal when they first come into a community, and it's very, there's this rigidity that tends to dissolve as we start to eat together and laugh together and cry together, and that is a part of the research process. That is a part of building relationships. That's not something you would typically find in just, going into a water treatment facility or something. So everything, if it's building a relationship and if it's breaking down those barriers, that's a part of the research process when it comes to this type of research.
Yep. And again, just briefly, a very important milestone in kind of my relationships is there's a woman in the band office that was always giving me a hard time, and she was teasing me. And like, obviously I walked in one day and she said something and I just had this horrified look like I did. And she, like, everyone just started laughing because it was like, they were just teasing me and just pulling my leg. And from then on, it was just like, it was this acceptance, right? And it's been great ever since, but it was that was a pretty important watershed moment. It's just that, like, I was kind of accepted, right?
That's such a, I don't want to make a lot of generalizations about Indigenous culture, but if there's one thing I know, and I've seen it quite a bit throughout my years as, being an Indigenous person, is if you're getting teased, you made it in.
Yeah, that's it.
So, my husband had no idea what that meant when he first met my family. He was put off just to no end that my aunties were just teasing him just incessantly. And I'm like, that means they like you. You have to roll with it. So you have to laugh together. And we've gone through, Indigenous people on this territory, we've gone through a lot of really horrible things. And maybe your ancestors have too. Maybe you have, right? But if you can laugh together, you can heal together. And if you can heal together, you're going to be able to do research together. So it is about building relationships. So talking a little bit about sort of the evolution of what this looks like on the ground, we've started off with sort of a spectrum of, we started with consultation and this concept of what consultation means, right? So that was pretty much the standard, was you need to consult a community, and somebody would go in and they would offer some Timmy's cards, and maybe 10 people would show up to a community meeting if you're lucky. And you'd give your presentation about what the project was about, and then a couple people would agree to it, and you'd have some paperwork signed, and then you just start doing your research. That's now kind of evolved a little bit, and we worked into consent where a little bit more was done, and then there was this sort of concept of the spirit of collaboration. You've come up with your research project, you've written all the grants, you've written the proposals, you've gotten everything passed through the research ethics board, and then you start looking for people to collaborate with in those communities. And that's kind of where a lot of research is right now. But what we're looking for and what we're doing at GWF is we're setting a new standard, and the standard is co-creation. So this is where we are, from the inception of a research question, we are working with Indigenous communities to ask that question together in ways that are meaningful for the community. At the end of this presentation, when we start talking about standards and policy, we're going to go through a list of questions that can be used. The community can use those questions themselves to judge whether or not a project is worthy of their time and energy. And you should probably be looking at, as a researcher, and just kind of bouncing that off and being reflexive and, answering those questions before you even come to a community with an idea. So what we're looking at is this spectrum and getting to that point where we're co-creating this research together. Do you have an example of that with your Northern Water Futures at all, or with your new project at all?
Well, I think I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about how to get on the spectrum, right?
Yeah.
For many of us, especially, Global Water Futures is framed around solving all the water quality issues on Indigenous lands, or First Nations reserves, I think it was worded in the proposal. So I think there is a push to engage and certainly move on the KM spectrum towards co-creation. But again, a lot of you are probably thinking like, okay, well, where do we start? And I think that's an important conversation that we're having. We talk about. So I'm just looking at the slide previous. If you can just bump back a slide.
Oh, sure.
Like consultation being, the first step. And some of that is like, saying hi and reaching out, right? For many of you, maybe starting your own research career, how do you intersect into this? And maybe a lot of you want to rush right into co-creation, and that's awesome. But that's a tricky thing to do, right? Through the past kind of KM webinars we've given, we've talked about, starting at square one and building towards something. And particularly with Indigenous communities, a lot of that is about relationship building and trust building. Okay, you don't just kind of show up and tell the community you have all the solutions to their problems. Sometimes it starts with an email exchange. Sometimes it starts with not even you approaching the community, right? One of the biggest players in, I guess my research career in the North was a person who was this knowledge broker, who knew of a community that had a question and knew of a researcher who had this interest and skill set, and they matched us together. And sometimes going through someone that knows the community is the best way to do that, right? For some of you, it could be your advisor. It could be someone within your research group, someone within your institution, maybe someone within Global Water Futures. But there are those people who have those connections and that kind of social capital that can become really important. Another conversation I've had in the North, a gentleman described his job. He worked in one of the resource offices at a band office, and he said, my job is like, my house is on fire and I have 3 buckets of water. Okay, so it's not that I am not interested in the project that you have. It's just that it can't fit on my plate. There's just too much happening. I can't worry about that right now. And so that is a big reality. We talk about the term capacity a lot, and it's a really weird term to use. But it also means time, right? Communities are inundated with a lot of different issues. Some legacy issues from the past that we've acknowledged today, and some really facing the issues of climate change. And of course, the stuff that we do as researchers can be part of that solution, but it's kind of building that relationship with the communities to know when a good time to engage is. Because, we know that climate change is really high on a lot of communities' radar right now, but sometimes it's not the top 10 because there's so many other things that communities have to deal with on a daily basis. That sometimes you're reaching out is, it's just not going to work, and that it's just a timing thing more than anything else. So, I guess where to start on the spectrum is really kind of asking around, kind of internally in your own project and your own institution to kind of figure out how a lot of your work can really be, communicated to communities, and how you can work together with Indigenous communities as a step one, I suppose.
And like you're saying, it's about sort of starting at the beginning, and it could be different for every one of you depending on what your relationships are with Indigenous communities. We're not going to assume that you don't have any connections with Indigenous communities. We're all surrounded by them. So even just as something as simple as going to a friendship center and participating in some socials and getting to know some Indigenous people in our, in social ways and celebratory ways and ways that actually begin building relationships. And just getting to know really where you are, because there is this sort of overlay of, you're in Hamilton or you're in Winnipeg, but who are the Indigenous communities there? And then oftentimes a researcher will come to me with a question or a project that they want to work with me on. And the first thing I ask them is, why do they want to do what they want to do? So really thinking about your own motivations and making sure that you're not coming from sort of this sort of savior-ish perspective where you're going to sweep in, you have the solution to their problems, and you're going to sweep in and you're going to change everything, but actually coming from more of that relationship perspective and hearing what those needs would be compared to what it is that you're trying to get done. So GWF is doing this co-creation thing pretty well, I would say. We have 6 Indigenous-led projects right now, including 9 Indigenous investigators across 11 universities. There are 14 Indigenous community involved currently, totaling $1.63 million in funding, and training right now at least 36 HQP, if not more. And that includes community members for sure, mostly community members actually. These are projects that are co-led with Western PIs and community-led PIs, and we're asking questions like, is our water good to drink? Water-related practices, perceptions, and traditional knowledge indicators for human health. There's the Fishnet Project, healthy water, healthy fish, healthy people. We need more than just water, assessing sediment limitation in a large freshwater delta. Mattawa First Nation is doing one on Mattawa water futures, developing an Indigenous-informed framework for watershed monitoring and stewardship. Right here on Six Nations territory, we're doing something called Aneganos, Indigenous Ecological Knowledge, Training and Co-Creation of Mixed Methods Tools with Dr. Don Martin-Hill. And I'll let Andrew talk about the Water Knowledge Camps, which is a really great project.
Yeah, and I think you'd see the theme of a lot of these projects is to bring both that kind of Western knowledge and traditional knowledge together. Okay, in the Northwest Territories, we've been told on many occasions that the way to do this is on the land. So we proposed with Leon, who was at the original meeting in Saskatoon, I guess a year or so ago. There's a lot of research that's happened in Indigenous communities. There's a legacy but where does that knowledge go is always the big question. So a lot of this was to bring together both the scientists and elders, land users, decision makers, and in a on the land setting for a week, we kind of go out into the bush for a week. We make camp. We talk about the science. We talk about community perceptions of that research, and we really build the foundation for understanding. Okay, and And I think what's really important here is that that informal space that those camps create, okay? Because you get to know people, not just in that formal setting of reporting back or presenting to a band council or something like that. It's that informal space of drying fish, of getting wood, of starting the fire, and those stories that you hear around the campfire. It's really about building relationships and building trust. And that's really the focus of what Water Knowledge Camps is all about. But you can see that as a theme in a lot of these different projects of really kind of bringing people together and sharing knowledge. And I think that's really the theme of this co-creation that we're trying to build throughout the Global Water Futures program.
The Anaganos project, for example, as well, is also using our traditional ecological knowledge, or what we call Indigenous science, to develop questions around water quality, water stewardship, and ultimately training youth to be able to take on water monitoring roles. So they're creating these mixed methods tools to be able to not just ask these questions, but then make some adaptations to what they're seeing in the community regarding water quality. They're doing some turtle tagging, which is not just a culturally relevant thing, but also is an indicator for what's happening in the water around Six Nations. And ultimately to take all of this and actually train youth to be able to carry this forward in a way that will help build some capacity in that community for us to be able to, and that's my home community, to be able to monitor our own water through an app that's being developed. There's also some ecological anxiety and grief going on, some work with mental health. So there's this app called Joy Pop that's a part of this project that's all focusing on mental health because they've noticed a huge disparity in suicide rates and mental health and illness issues happening, all stemmed from this concept of climate change induced anxiety and grief that is a very real thing. So there's an epidemic of suicides happening on First Nations, and if we can in any way staunch that bleeding, we're going to try that. And this is a great project that's addressing not just questions on the land, but really looking at how we are interconnected with that land. And as Indigenous people, seeing that steamroller of climate change coming at us slowly but surely, knowing the damage it's going to cause. And we're constantly thinking in our worldview about those next 7 generations, or the generations, or what we call the faces to come, knowing that they're going to inherit this. That causes a deep amount of grief and a deep amount of anxiety and sadness in all people, but specifically Indigenous people. So really looking at the issues and what the community wants, and creating it and wrapping around this research, the capacity that we're building, and the resources we can provide in research to be able to answer these questions and actually come out the other end with some actionable solutions. So those are just 2 examples of what's going on just here at Global Water Futures. There's also projects going on across Turtle Island with other universities, other water institutes, other Indigenous studies programs, and then just ultimately in the academy in general, that are all working toward that same co-creative process. I just wanted to share this, a little bit of a Doctrine Hill thing about what's happening. I don't think it's going to happen on here. We'd have to be on Google Slides. I'll send everybody the link to this video. It's also on our Global Water Futures website, and that is, it's a video of, I think this is the McMaster University portion of the video, but Dr. Martin Hill is talking about Indigenous ecological knowledge and how valuable that is in research. But because of the way that we're working on PowerPoint and WebEx, it doesn't want to work for us. So yeah, there's this concept that we were talking about earlier about what Indigenous knowledge is and what research is and isn't. And there's this tendency to relegate Indigenous knowledge to something we call pseudoscience, which is a Western concept. And pseudoscience is basically relegating anything that doesn't make sense to our Western brains within our Western scientific framework of observable and tangible evidence-based research as being something that isn't worthy of inquiry. That can, in Indigenous communities, be a huge problem when we see things like prophecy being an indicator. Prophecy is actually what we would look at in the Western terms as modeling and forecasting. So kind of looking and understanding the worldview a little bit better to know that we have our own ways of being, doing, and knowing that really do, that are not only valuable, but really deserve respect. So really respecting that pluralism of knowledge and acknowledging that we have diverse ways of knowing that have been working for us for a long, long time before people came here. They're working quite well. And it's interesting because if you see, there was a study that was just completed and published about climate change and First Nations and colonization, and that there was a direct impact from colonization that created climate change, not because of this sort of deforestation, but almost a reforestation that occurred after genocide happened. So we have been stewards of the land for a very long time, and we have a complex and interconnected relationship with the land. We steward large, vast areas of territory, and when this genocide swept over Turtle Island, there were many areas that actually renaturalized outside of. So our food forests were sort of slowly repopulated, and what happened was there was this mini ice age. So there are some really interesting researches that just came out that had findings that correlated with the genocide being directly related to this mini ice age. That's just one way of looking at it. And then also just looking at our traditional teachings, so our stories. We don't have oftentimes a written record. We don't have written history. So there's this concept of oral tradition that is very, very important in Indigenous knowledge. And oral history has been discounted in research since the inception of academic research. We are an oral people, and we've passed on our knowledge through stories that we can repeat and retell at during the cycle of the year. That is the way that we pass on, the way that we engage with our environment, the way that we survived as a people all these years. Honestly, it's a very complex technology. I consider oral history one of the most complex technologies out there because it's neurological, and we have no way of really understanding it yet. There's also empirical observation, and again, like I said, revelation. There are revelations in what we would call prophecy that have foretold the coming of many different things, like the Black Snake prophecy, which is the prophecy that is now manifesting all over Turtle Island and the pipelines that are happening. There's a prophecy here in this territory about that there's something deeply problematic with our ecosystem, or with Turtle Island, if you see the trees dying from the top down. So these are things that people are picking up, and they've passed on, and they're saying, watch out for these things, and if you see them happening, we know that we need to act in a certain way. That's what we would see here in Western research is a really intricate forecasting and modeling system. So listen to those things and kind of look at them juxtaposed next to your own ways of seeing those things as well. It can be personal, it can be oral, it can be experiential. It's oftentimes very holistic, and it's conveyed often in a narrative or a metaphor, because those are the stories. That's the way we can remember stories, is by taking that information and wrapping it around a narrative, a metaphorical narrative that we can remember. So we talk about here, there's the story about the great bear in the sky. So this is about passing on how it's about looking at the stars and seeing Sirius, the Sirius system, and there's a certain Ursa Major, which is the constellation of Ursa Major, which is the Great Bear, the cosmic bear, and we have a whole story around the cosmic bear and these brothers chasing the bear. It's told at a certain time of the year, and what it's telling us is this is the time to hunt, and this is why the leaves turned red at this time. So it's really telling us and giving us an understanding of why our world is the way that it is and how we act within that world. So when we do ceremony, when we harvest certain things, when we plant our seeds, It's all about story and metaphor, and we pass that on. It's just easier to pass it on that way. And that was Dr. Dawn Martin-Hill that brought that up, and she's one of our PIs. Did you want to add anything to that, Andrew?
Sorry, I was on mute. No, I'm good, thanks.
Okay. So this is it's kind of hard to see this, but we were talking a little bit about the concept of what is research, what is traditional knowledge, and what is, that there's sort of this overlap between some of those things. So some of the commonalities that we have as Western scientists and Indigenous people, we do have a common ground. And we kind of think about this in things like data sharing, for example. So we really need to talk about data sharing in this webinar, and what is appropriate to save and what is appropriate for the community to hold on to and not share, and what we need in order to be able to do our work. So things like traditional knowledge doesn't necessarily need to be held on to, but things like empirical we're not saying hold on to, meaning like you're not going to take that data and share it in a way outside of that community. But things like empirical observation and in natural settings and pattern recognitions and verification through repetition, inferences and predictions, plant and animal behavior, the properties of objects and materials, these are things that overlap within Western science and Indigenous knowledge, and that's kind of the common ground that we're looking at for asking the community, or at least speaking in a way that acknowledges that this is valuable information on both sides of the spectrum, that we really would like to see what your empirical observations are. It's not a ceremony-related piece of information. It's not a sensitive piece of information. It's really going to help us understand our research questions better. Anything you want to add, Andrew?
Well, I guess where this kind of goes logically is really about data, and what data goes where, and who wants the data and all that stuff, right? Like, there is a data management program here at Global Water Futures is a really good example, where science data is shared and made public. We like to say TK is the property of the community and therefore it is locked down. But, as you point out here, Steph, there is this kind of middle ground of data that kind of fits in both. And what to do with that becomes a very, I guess, complicated dialogue to have, because some of it would be very valuable in terms of the research that we do, but how community perceives that as, does it fall under kind of traditional knowledge or not, is a really important conversation to have, and a really important conversation to have early. For the stuff that I do, I sign data sharing agreements with communities. And it says that the data that we collect is owned by the community. And if we want to use that, we have to ask. And from the institutional side, the university is sometimes alarmed by those data sharing agreements, because we're always pushed now to make all the data that we collect publicly available. So you can see there are kind of a push and pull there sometimes, but as part of a respectful and engaged dialogue and trust with the community, that's a really important conversation to have early on with your community partners, is to what is going to happen with this data, what is valuable to share, and what is important for the community to hold on to. And I think that's just a fundamental part of the relationship that you're building as researchers with your community partners.
So we want to get into some of the hows of how to do this. This is a great segue. So of course we're saying relationship. It's all about building relationships. We want to be able to, we're not dropping in out of the sky. We're coming in knowing somebody and then knowing somebody else. And essentially, if you're going to be doing research in a community, you're going to want to be kind of a common place. People are going to want to know who you are. That's just, some of these communities are very, very small. Like you were saying, 40 people. That's basically the size of my family. So you're going to stand out like a sore thumb sometimes. But as you build relationships, that discomfort will subside. We want to acknowledge that there's an imbalance of power and adjust that accordingly. One of the ways that you can do that is by doing what we call a meaningful land and territory acknowledgement as you're going through some of the public things that you're doing, even at your own institutions. And meaningful is the operative word there. We'll talk a tiny bit about that in a minute. Educate yourself. Look at what reconciliation really is. Do that consultation. We're going to talk a little bit about the policies around that have been built in order to be able to protect Indigenous communities that have been created by Indigenous communities, like Tri-Council policy and OCAP. And ultimately, we want to be able to co-create research, gain that social capital in a way that's real and not just because you need that in order to leverage your relationship or leverage your research. And ultimately, you're going to need community members to tell you how to follow protocol, because protocol is different in every territory. So, you talk about not wanting, or, I hear oftentimes, I don't want to offend somebody. Well, just ask questions, there's no stupid question, as long as you ask it respectfully. So I think you're not meant to go into a community being an expert after having read a history about that territory or that nation. You're going to get to know that community by being in that community and getting to know the people there. Every single one of our 6 nations reserves, for example, has a different history, so and a different language. So yeah, just being able to ask those questions and have some humility. Go ahead.
So I was going to say, quick time check.
Yeah, we're about 13 minutes out. Yes, thanks. So just quickly, the meaningful concept behind land acknowledgements really talks about this concept that happens with institutions oftentimes called optics. And what optics are the explicit forms of culture, the singing, the dancing, the crafts, the foods. Oftentimes, there's universities will create something visually representing their connection or dedication to reconciliation, whether it's an outdoor teaching area, or they'll put a feather on one of their letterheads or something like that. We're looking at working with understanding the implicit culture, the reasons why we do those things, and then maybe you don't totally understand them, but at least having an understanding of something deeper than just those optical things. I'll skip over that because we talked about it. So some ways that you can engage with community are meeting informally with community members, definitely consulting with elders, not people who have a card that says elder, but asking the community who your elders are, working with a community advisory group or a review body, and negotiating a research agreement with formal leadership, and that means possibly traditional as well as band leadership. So I want to get into this beast of the Tri-Council policy and OCAP. We're not going to, you all have to adhere to these policies as you're writing these proposals, going through ethics. And it's Chapter 9 is the specific part of the policy that focuses on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Andrew, do you have anything to add to, or that you really want to highlight around Tri-Council that, as you've been writing your proposals, you've done all 3 of the Tri-Council that you've gotten funded? Are there things that jump out at you that you think are important for folks to know?
I think the important point is that they're still evolving. And I think, Tri-Council is still trying to wrap their head around what reconciliation means. So what this is right now is probably going to be something different in the near future. Tri-Council is putting a really big push on having Indigenous co-leads on research. CIHR is really big on that. SHRC is also big on that. But I think they still don't know exactly what that means and how to do it. A really good example of that is we got a few Indigenous co-Is on a CIHR grant, and they had to go through this really strange and invasive questionnaire. So even their progressive policies around funding still have some of these things that aren't really appropriate to ask communities to do. But, it's there, and I think it's a good start, and I think we haven't seen the final product yet.
Yeah, and really, tri-council policy, it's like it says here, it's a framework for ethical conduct. It's something that, like you're saying, is evolving, and it really needs to be, it's not really intended to override or replace ethical guidance offered by us ourselves. So it's almost like that's the bare minimum of what you should be doing, but you can really certainly exceed that. And the ethical framework is really considering the respect, the concern for our welfare, and this principle of justice and balancing out that power. So the respect for people means to honor every individual and every community's capacity for sovereignty and to make free and informed decisions, which includes the freedom to refuse to participate in a study. The principle for that concern for welfare protects our interests as individuals, and it's balanced with the care for our physical, social, and economic and cultural environments. And justice is a really big one. It's definitely kind of this new concept that really it's replacing the concept of equity. So equity is where you see that little infographic where you see those three people on the boxes, and there's a fence in front of them, and the boxes can get people. If you're shorter, you have a higher box, and it helps you see over the fence. Well, justice is really the removal of the fence. It's the removal of the system, or it's dealing with combating the system that has actually created the disparities in equity. And then the ethical framework really needs to benefit our research groups. It has to support capacity building in our communities when possible. So really involving us in every stage of the research process, and being able to have us determine our own levels of what capacity building means. OCAP that was designed actually by First Nations people. So Tri-Council was sort of done in collaboration with, but OCAP was actually created by us for us, and that's really what our goals are, is to have research created by us for us, and that's really been used to be able to access funds. It's helping us access or assess community health and evaluate the effectiveness of health interventions. It's helping us develop strategies and plans for services and programs in our communities. And I want to be clear with the word community, we're not just talking about reserves. That's something that we have to kind of break out of the mold, that all Indigenous people just live on reserves. I did not grow up on a reserve. I don't live on a reserve. I've lived on a reserve in my life, but I don't now. I think there's a sense of shame sometimes with Indigenous people who don't live on reserves, because there is an intense concentration of Indigenous community and culture on reserves. But we have to remember that reserves are boundaries that were created by the federal government. So that doesn't circumscript us to those little tiny areas. In fact, it can be quite traumatic to think about having to live imposed in those barriers. So I just want to be clear with that concept that communities are everywhere. You have Indigenous community here in Hamilton that is in the central area, but we come together from all over. So anyway, lobby for policy and policy changes. We use research to preserve and revive our traditional languages. We use it to appropriately document and preserve traditional information and ceremonies. It supports our land claims. It prevents projects or developments that negatively impact our communities from happening. And it's really a way to participate in a First Nations created environment that promotes the pursuit of beneficial research and its ethical application. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. It's necessary to be able to work with us in an OCAP is a way to say yes to beneficial research and no to research that is not relevant or results in harm. And OCAP stands for ownership, access, control, and possession. So ownership of the data, access to the data, control of the data, and possession of the data. Did you want to talk at all about OCAP, Andrew?
No, I'm good. We got 5 minutes. So
okay, 5 minutes. So, and we're gonna give you these slides, and we're gonna be doing two more PowerPoint or two more presentations on this. So again, this is a high-level overview. But some of the strategies I wanted to talk about with OCAP just quickly are those community consultations, speaking with elders and leaders in a community, becoming informed of what other communities are doing and what strategies they're adopting, setting up committees to develop research guidelines and protocols, developing frameworks that are based on our cultures, methods, tools, trainings, and review and reporting strategies. So you can see these are very driven by our voice. And then developing a community code of research ethics. Six Nations has a research ethics board, and I think that's becoming more popular. Also developing criteria for evaluation, establishing research review boards, like we said, and then negotiating our research relationships and management of those projects. So there's a list of questions that we're going to provide to you at the end that you can use, that I was mentioning before, that you can reflect on as you're asking these research questions, and that Indigenous communities are asking themselves when they're entertaining working with you. So some of those questions are things like, what are the major health, social, economic, and environmental issues that this research will address? Is it a priority for our community? Has a project like this already been done? Are the community members going to be involved? How is the project going to involve our people? Are they going to be hired? Is it going to benefit our community? What are the risks and harms of the project? And do those risks or harms outweigh the benefits of the project? And then ultimately, does this research abide by our code of research ethics? So that's just a nutshell with those questions. Again, we'll give you those, we'll give you the link to the PDF to that. And then again, we're involving community members on and off reserve, all types of governance systems, organizations, youth and elders are key that you want to engage, and really people that are already standing up for water protection and land protection. And ultimately, the last slide I want to share with you is this term that was borrowed from the disability community, but it speaks just as well to this, and that's nothing about us without us. If you're going to be doing research on Indigenous issues in an Indigenous territory, you have to include us. And we're really excited to be included as well. So with that, I want to thank you for coming. And there's a lot of questions that are coming that we'll be using for the next 2 webinars. So please send them to us by email. We have them in the chat box. This is a lot of information to go over in a short period of time. I see one from Sarah Newell saying, I would like to have insight about knowledge mobilization and dissemination following research, collaborating with or co-creating with Indigenous people. So dissemination, one great way of doing that, just really quickly, would be, say, digital storytelling. That's one that I do quite often. So we're not talking publications so much, we're talking about ways that the community will see that work. So art, community meetings, celebrations, feasts, ways to incorporate it into cultural programming, just so many awesome ways to disseminate knowledge. But ultimately, it's about nothing about us without us. So thanks, Andrew, for working with me on this webinar. Thanks, everybody, for dialing in and staying with us to the bitter end. We have our email. Mine is mornings@mcmaster.ca. Andrew, what's yours?
aspring@wlu.ca.
wlu.ca.
Yeah, I did post that in the chat box.
Oh, perfect.
And again, before you leave, if you have any other questions, just we're recording all this, and we do take the chat box very seriously, because we're going to do this again, but it'd be great to know what other things you guys want to hear so we can incorporate that into future planning. We're hoping to have a few field trips in the summer, in the near future, for the Southern Ontario institutions, but also incorporate some more of this training into the annual science meeting. So there's lots of things going on. Again, feel free to email Steph, myself, or your local KM specialist, Steph Merrill at SASC, or Nancy at UW. Yeah, again, thanks. This has been a lot of fun. But again, we're going to continue this. But please send us your ideas.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Send us more questions, and then we'll make sure to frame the next 2 webinars around that. thanks to Global Water Futures for providing the space for this, and for just doing the great work that they're doing with Indigenous co-creative and Indigenous-led projects. It's really been an honor to be a part of that. And I'll say Nyawasgeno, which means thank you for being. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you at the next one.